It's Saturday, September 28th, 2024, and we are 37 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Harms. On the show today, Kamala Harris visits the U.S.-Mexico border and gives a speech that could very well change the race, but also changes years of Democratic politics. And I'm going to apologize up top here and say this mini, not exactly mini today, but that's just how big of a deal this is. So Harris was in Arizona yesterday meeting with Border Patrol and other officials along the border there, and according to the president of the Border Patrol Union, which has actually endorsed Donald Trump, this was Harris's first visit to the border since 2021. Now, even if she wasn't actually the border czar, which critics of her have said, she did have a crucial position in shaping the Biden-Harris administration's approach to immigration, so not going there for 3 years is a long time. And her visit also comes against the backdrop of some new numbers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement that were collected and released at the request of a conservative representative from Texas earlier this week. Now, those numbers said that there were about 7.5 million people currently on ICE's list of non-detained, undocumented immigrants, including as many as 13,000 convicted murderers, which as a percentage is 17 thousandths of a percent. That's 3 zeros and a 17 after the decimal point of the whole number of non-detained undocumented population. And I do need to say here too that 80% of non-detained undocumented immigrants show up to their court dates that are scheduled for them. And study after study for years, including one found that immigrants, undocumented or not, are 60% less likely to end up in jail than native-born citizens. And on top of that, NBC is reporting that law enforcement sources close to the data that I talked about there said that many of those criminals were actually allowed into the country under previous administrations, including Donald Trump. Now, none of that matters to conservatives who want to pin the immigration crisis on Harris, which is maybe not exactly the reason those numbers were released, but the timing of that shouldn't be ignored. So, like I said, all of that is a backdrop to Harris's speech, and I actually want to talk about the literal backdrop of her speech, like what was physically behind her and what her speech physically looked like, because these things are choreographed and planned, and a speech this important to this campaign was, without a doubt, choreographed. So Harris was standing in front of a giant American flag, or at the very least, just the red and white stripes of the flag. It's not something you see politicians do very often because it makes things look like a military campaign. It makes them look like George C. Scott from Patton. And it did have real commander-in-chief vibes, I'm not going to lie. And then there was what Harris was wearing, and I don't mean that in a way that's like offensive to women, but in a way that when we see her normally, she's in a suit and a blouse or a t-shirt with heels or Converse on. In this speech, she was in a black shirt and a tan field jacket, decidedly tactical looking, and not in the way that the guy from work who wears tactical polos and cargo shorts to the office does, in a way that like leaders look tactical when they're in full boots on the ground mode. It was a stark contrast to how Trump looks when he's gone to the border, which is exactly the same as he always looks: the blue suit, the long red tie, the white shirt, sometimes maybe a blue tie, but either way, it's a suit and tie. And when he does that, it always looks a little strange to me. I always find myself wondering how he doesn't overheat because it's like 100 degrees down there and suits are hot. Anyway, Harris did not look or feel out of place, and all of that added to what she said, where, to quote my guest from yesterday, Mike Madrid, the speech she gave was transformative. Harris staked out a much harder line on border security than any serious Democratic candidate in a primary or not since at least Obama in 2012, maybe before that. She talked about her career as the Attorney General of California, where she prosecuted drug and human traffickers from across the southern border, and that she led a group of attorneys general from multiple states and from both parties to share intelligence with Mexican attorneys general to increase prosecuting transnational gangs. So this was interesting because Harris has, for the most part, shied away from talking about her time as a prosecutor. In this race in particular, it's been a tricky part of her past and her legacy as a politician because a lot of Democratic voters don't feel so great about her time as the Attorney General of California and as a prosecutor. She did pushed for longer, harsher sentences for many low-level and nonviolent offenders. She also skirted a Supreme Court ruling to keep nonviolent criminals in jail, in some cases putting in filings that judges and legal experts condemned for being obstructionist, bad faith, and nonsensical. She's also been blamed, in part, but for directly increasing California's mass incarceration problem, and was criticized by some of her fellow prosecutors for trying to do some revisionist history about her time as a prosecutor in California. So taking a hard turn towards being a law and order president, or a would-be president, on the border as forcefully as this is a sea change for her. But let's get back to the speech here. She talked a lot about the bipartisan border bill that was killed in Congress by Trump last year that I talked about in yesterday's episode and I've talked about before. But that's really the basis of her immigration plan, or really her whole plan, and talked about the need to work across the aisle to find ideas. And she used that to contrast against Trump. Take a listen.
The United States is a sovereign nation, and I believe we have a duty to set rules at our border and to enforce them. And I take that responsibility very seriously. We are also a nation of immigrants. The United States has been enriched by generations of people who have come from every corner of the world to contribute to our country and to become part of the American story. And so we must reform our immigration system to ensure that it works in an orderly way, that it is humane, and that it makes our country stronger.
So I'm going to talk about the contrast a little bit more here later in this episode, but making the choice to present her policies and Trump's policies as serious versus not serious is a marked change in the way we've heard Democrats talk about their policies versus Republicans, which usually they define as humane versus inhumane. And I'm going to talk more about that, like I said, in a minute. But what Harris said next was something that I was really surprised to hear. It's not often that something in a political speech makes me stop and exclaim something out loud. But when she said what I'm about to play for you, I actually said, whoa, out loud to an empty apartment.
And as president, I won't only bring back the border security bill that Donald Trump tanked. I will do more to secure our border. To reduce illegal border crossings, I will take further action to keep the border closed between ports of entry. Those who cross our borders unlawfully will be apprehended and removed and barred from re-entering for 5 years. We will pursue more severe criminal charges against repeat violators. And if someone does not make an asylum request at a legal point of entry and instead crosses our border unlawfully, they will be barred from receiving asylum.
To say that these policies are further to the right is an understatement. What Harris is proposing would make the Obama administration blush, and Obama was called deporter-in-chief by civil rights groups. I'm also not sure how these policies will play with Democrats across the country who want Democrats to have a more compassionate approach to immigration, and making it harder to seek asylum ain't that. Harris also talked about stopping the flow of fentanyl into the country, which a Senate report from last year found that fentanyl made up 99% of all the seizures at the southern border. Fentanyl is also a huge issue in states across the country, including key swing states like Nevada, Arizona, and critically, Pennsylvania. In fact, those stats that I just cited there were from a report from the office of Pennsylvania Senator Bob Casey. So Harris talking about fentanyl is big. It's also something we haven't heard Democrats talk a lot about because it always brings the discussion back to the border, where Democrats are seen as weak. Now, Harris called the flow of fentanyl unacceptable and said she would surge support to law enforcement on the front lines. Again, going back to that military-style rhetoric that's reminiscent of the war on drugs in the context of this, but also invokes a war on immigrants, which, again, could turn off some Democratic voters. So Harris pledged more resources, personnel training, and 100 new inspection systems to find drugs in vehicles for Border Patrol agents, not just at the southern border, but at airports and seaports as well. And she said she would double federal resources in the Department of Justice to be able to extradite cartel members trafficking and selling fentanyl to the U.S. And that's a pretty hard line, especially when it comes to American law enforcement crossing international lines. But it's about here that Harris pivoted into talking about fixing the immigration issues within the immigration system, which is a space where Democrats are much more comfortable speaking. And it's a space that Democratic voters traditionally like their candidates to be in because the U.S. needs people to immigrate into the country to keep the economy going. And in the minds of Democrats, the U.S. has never been a nation of closed borders as a matter of our collective identity. Think of the Statue of Liberty. So here's what Harris had to say about fixing the immigration system.
The false choice. I reject the false choice that suggests we must either choose between securing our border or creating a system of immigration that is safe, orderly, and humane. We can and we must do both.
So to do that, she promised to work with Congress to expand asylum processing centers in other countries for people who plan to apply for it here in the U.S. She talked about the plan in that border bill that would hire more asylum officers and expand immigration courts to have more judges on them. And she made it a point to say it wasn't just for people coming to the U.S. for the first time, but for asylum seekers who have been living in the U.S. while their cases are being processed, which is a process that can take years. And to not know if you can start a life, put roots down in the U.S. while your paperwork is in limbo is stressful for a lot of people and their families, to say the least. She also talked about children who were brought into the U.S. illegally by their parents, known as Dreamers or DACA recipients. She called them American in every way, and she said that she wants a legal pathway to citizenship for those people, many of whom are now adults. She also said she wants to create a pathway to citizenship for farm workers who are in the U.S. illegally and are and have been for decades the foundation of America's food industries. Now, she didn't have as many actual plans for this part of her immigration plan, but promised to work with Congress and work across the aisle to get those things done. For a lot of these things, she would have to work with Congress. The fixes she's talking about require new laws and changes to laws, and those have to come from Congress, but they are promises, and people keep track of promises candidates make. I'm one of them. And people remember those promises when candidates get elected. So I want to pull out a bit here and talk about what this speech means, not just in the context of the race for president, but also in the context of American politics, because this was one of those speeches and certainly will be looked at in that way should Harris get elected. In the context of just the race for the White House, Harris redefined at least border security and immigration as a choice, like I said before, between serious and unserious. But when you put this speech up against Trump's proposals like mass deportation, the camps, the ideological screenings, it doesn't just make Harris's proposals today look solution-oriented, but it makes Trump's solutions look nakedly xenophobic and about the demographics of the country instead of actually what needs to be done about immigration. Now, his policies have always been that, but without what felt like concrete or acceptable plans from Democrats, a lot of people have just shrugged at what Trump has said and said at least he's got plans. And now I'm not saying that there weren't massive backlashes to his policies while he was in office, because there were. It's just that a lot of average people chose to hold their noses and look away because they didn't feel like there was an alternative. In this speech, Harris gave them one. And then when it comes to what this means for Harris in the swing states, obviously we don't know exactly what it means or how people are receiving this speech. This just happened yesterday. This happened last night. So we don't know polling about it yet. But it was aimed directly at voters in Arizona, Nevada, and maybe partially in Texas. Now, in Arizona, I've talked about this before. There's a huge Senate race happening there where the Democrat is winning by double digits. Abortion is on the ballot, and support for it there is up near 60%. But Harris is down in Arizona despite those things, and the border is likely a huge reason why. For the things that I just said about the border before, but Trump appearing to be the only one in the race with a plan. Now, this speech changes that for Arizona voters who may have been thinking about splitting their ticket in voting for the abortion rights amendment, voting for the popular Democratic candidate for the Senate seat, and then voting for Trump. This might change that calculus. The same thing goes for Nevada, which isn't a border state, but it's so close that a lot of voters operate like it is. And then in the broader election, this speech could have a ripple effect into Texas. The Senate race in Texas right now is about a 3.5-point average race where Senator Ted Cruz could lose his seat. He is leading the race right now, but he's not well liked by Texans. A recent poll said a majority of Texans had an unfavorable view of him. So if this speech and the prospect of a tougher on-the-border Democratic president trickles down into that race, which it very well could, because the candidate, the representative there, Colin Allred, is well-liked and has a track record of working on immigration in Congress, if this speech from Harris trickles down and that emotion gets down into the Allred race, they could flip a seat in Texas, which would be a huge deal for Democrats and maybe the future of the Democratic Party in Texas. Now, finally, this speech from Harris also marks a shift in Democratic politics as a whole, and thus American politics. If this works, Harris reshapes how her party approaches one of the top issues in the country. It reframes how Democrats talk about the border, and on a more fundamental level, it reframes how people understand the Democratic platform as a whole. It's often said that people see the Republican Party as the daddy party and the Democratic Party as the mommy party, which is a bonkers, outdated way to talk about this thing. But what it really means is that people see Republicans as tough and strong and about money and the military, while Democrats are compassionate and caring, maybe a little weak, but good on things like education and healthcare. And while Republicans have abandoned trying to be compassionate conservatives in a way that they were talking about it 20 years ago, in this speech, Harris outlined a way for Democrats to be, let's call it, powerful progressives, to stick with alliteration there. And we haven't seen that from Democrats in a long time. Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Again, sorry it wasn't exactly mini today. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app that you're using. Like and subscribe to this on YouTube. Also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got the extended interview with my guest from yesterday, the author of the brand new book, The Latino Century, Mike Madrid. And as always, share the show on social media. It really helps get the word out and helps the show out a lot. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Make sure to tag me in those posts as well. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.